The sun was just beginning to rise over the jagged mountains of the Wild West, casting a soft orange glow on the rocky landscape. Dust rose in small clouds as a lone traveler made his way along a narrow trail, his boots crunching against the dry earth. He had been on the road for weeks, traveling through vast deserts, crossing rivers, and climbing hills, with nothing but the open sky above him. He had always been drawn to the unknown, to places that few dared to go, and the stories of untamed lands had filled his imagination since he was a child. But nothing in his past had prepared him for what he would soon discover. The traveler's name was James, a man in his early 30s, with sun-tanned skin and eyes that reflected both curiosity and caution. He carried a small pack on his back, containing a few personal belongings, dried meat, and a flask of water. His horse, a sturdy chestnut stallion named Thunder, followed closely behind, its hooves kicking up dust with every step. The wind was strong in this part of the mountains, carrying with it the scent of sagebrush and the faint smell of pine from higher up the slopes. James adjusted his wide-brimmed hat and squinted toward the distant peaks. Somewhere beyond them lay a hidden valley, a place untouched by settlers or traders, where people lived as they had generations ago. That was the place he sought. After several hours of climbing, James reached a rocky ledge and stopped to catch his breath. He scanned the valley below, and his eyes widened in surprise. Nestled among the trees and surrounded by small cliffs was a settlement unlike any he had seen before. Smoke curled from several small chimneys, and he could see figures moving between the huts. But there was something unusual about the settlement. As he observed more closely, he noticed that the people were all women. They worked together, carrying water from a stream, tending to gardens, and mending clothes near the open fires. There were no men in sight. Not one. Curiosity mixed with caution in James's mind. He had heard tales of remote villages where women had taken on all the responsibilities after men were lost in battles or raids. But he had never witnessed such a place himself. The women moved with purpose and skill, clearly experienced in survival and life in isolation. Despite the absence of men, the settlement thrived in its own way. Gardens flourished, animals were tended to, and the huts were well maintained. James felt a strange mix of admiration and disbelief. How had they managed for so long without men? And what stories could they tell about the past 15 years? Thunder whinnied softly, reminding James that he was still present in the valley, an outsider in a world where he did not belong. He dismounted carefully, patting the horse's neck to calm it. He had to be careful. The women might see him as a threat, and he knew that any sudden move could cause alarm. So he remained hidden behind a cluster of rocks, observing quietly. He watched a group of women near the stream, filling clay jars with water. One of them, a tall woman with dark braided hair, looked up and glanced around suspiciously. Her eyes were sharp, her posture alert. It was clear that the women had learned to protect themselves, to be cautious of strangers, and to survive in a world that had not always been kind. James remembered the stories he had heard from travelers and explorers. They spoke of Apache women who had become experts in hunting, farming, and defending their homes after losing their men in conflicts. Some said they had gone for years without seeing a man, relying solely on their own strength and unity. James had always admired such resilience in stories. But now, standing in the shadow of the rocks and watching them with his own eyes, he felt a deep respect and a little fear. These were not ordinary women. They were survivors, warriors in their own right, shaped by hardship and necessity. As the sun rose higher, James decided it was time to move closer, but carefully. He did not want to frighten them or cause distrust. He took a few cautious steps down the slope, making sure not to snap any branches underfoot. The women glanced in his direction but returned to their tasks after a moment. Sensing no immediate threat, James marveled at their coordination. One woman skillfully milled corn while another repaired a broken fence. They spoke to each other in soft tones, and sometimes laughed quietly, showing that life here, despite its challenges, was not without joy. It was a life of balance, where every person contributed, where every task mattered, and where survival depended on cooperation and careful planning. He moved closer to the settlement, his heart beating faster. Every step brought new discoveries. He noticed children playing near a small creek, their laughter echoing off the rocks. Older women were teaching younger girls to weave baskets and make pottery. Each hut was simple but well built, with thatched roofs and walls of mud and wood. Smoke from cooking fires rose gently into the morning air, carrying the smell of herbs and roasted meat. Everything spoke of a community that had adapted to isolation, of a people who had found a way to thrive without relying on outsiders. James felt humbled by their skill and determination. Despite his admiration, he knew he had to approach with respect. He remembered the lessons his father had taught him about meeting new people in unknown lands. Always observe first, offer help, and never assume trust. He found a small clearing near the edge of the settlement and began to prepare a small gift, a few pieces of dried meat and berries from his pack. It was a humble offering, but it might show that he meant no harm. He carefully arranged the food on a flat rock and stepped back, hoping someone would notice. A young woman with a gentle face noticed the gift. She hesitated for a moment, then approached cautiously. James kept his hands visible, showing that he carried nothing dangerous. When she saw the offering, her expression softened slightly. She looked back at her companions, who whispered among themselves. Then she picked up the food and examined it, still wary but curious. James nodded, smiling warmly, and spoke in a calm voice, introducing himself. She did not reply at first, but her eyes conveyed understanding. He realized that trust here would not come easily, and it would take time to show that he was not a threat. As the day progressed, James observed more of the settlement's daily life. He watched the women gather wild herbs, hunt small game, and prepare food over open fires. Each task required skill and attention, and they performed them with quiet efficiency. He began to understand the rhythm of their lives, the way they divided work, the way they protected each other, and the way they balanced survival with moments of community and care. It was a harsh life, but it was also one of dignity and purpose. By evening, James had made a small breakthrough. The young woman who had accepted his gift returned to him with a few questions, asking in simple words who he was and why he had come. He answered honestly, telling her of his travels and his curiosity about the hidden valley. She listened carefully, then ran back to tell the others. That night, he camped on the edge of the settlement, keeping a respectful distance, and watched as the women gathered around a fire, singing softly and sharing stories from the past. He could sense the weight of 15 years of survival, of hardship and courage, in every word and song. James realized that he was witnessing something rare and precious. These women had created a world of their own, a world where they had relied on each other, defended their home, and preserved their way of life against countless challenges. And now, after 15 years, a stranger had arrived not to conquer or interfere, but simply to observe and perhaps learn. He felt a mixture of humility and excitement. For the first time in many days, he felt a sense of connection, even if it was tentative and fragile. As he drifted to sleep under the stars, James thought about the days ahead. He would need patience, respect, and careful actions if he wanted to gain the trust of the women. But he also knew that this journey could change him, that he might learn lessons about courage, resilience, and the power of community that he could never have imagined. The mountains around him were quiet now, but the next day promised challenges, discoveries, and perhaps the beginning of a bond that had been 15 years in the making. The morning sun broke through the mountain peaks, sending warm light across the valley. James stirred from his sleep, stretching under the sky as birds began their morning songs. The night had been quiet except for the crackling of distant fires from the settlement. He rose slowly, careful not to make a sound that would alarm the women. His mind was still full of thoughts about the previous day, the women's resilience, their careful watch over each other, and the quiet strength that radiated from the settlement. Today, he hoped, he would take the next step in gaining their trust. After a simple breakfast of dried meat and wild berries, James approached the settlement with caution. He kept to the edges, letting the women notice him rather than startling them with sudden movements. At first, they watched him silently, their eyes alert and assessing. He could sense their unease, and he reminded himself to be patient. Trust could not be forced here. It had to be earned through consistent respect and helpfulness. He decided to begin by offering assistance with daily chores. One of the women, the young one who had accepted his gift the previous day, was tending to a small garden filled with vegetables and herbs. She paused when she saw him approach. James nodded politely and began helping by clearing weeds and moving stones that blocked the small irrigation channels. His hands, though unskilled in some of the finer tasks, were steady and careful. The woman watched him silently at first, then slowly offered instructions, guiding him on how to dig without damaging the young plants. As the morning passed, James found that helping in small ways allowed him to connect with the women without words. He assisted in collecting firewood, fetching water from the stream, and carrying baskets of harvested vegetables. Each time he offered help, the women seemed to notice, though they still remained cautious. He learned to work quietly, observing their techniques and mimicking them as best he could. His respect for their skill grew with every passing hour. These women had not only survived in isolation, they had learned to thrive, and their knowledge of the land, animals, and plants was remarkable. Around midday, James was invited to sit near a fire with a few of the women while they prepared a simple meal. They cooked small pieces of game over open flames and added herbs from the garden. Although they spoke in a language he could not understand fully, their gestures and expressions conveyed warmth and curiosity. He learned to nod, smile, and respond respectfully, realizing that communication could extend beyond words. Through shared tasks, he began to sense a rhythm to their lives, a balance between work and rest, survival and community. It was during this meal that one of the older women, her face lined with experience and wisdom, finally spoke a few words in a way James could understand. "Why are you here?" she asked gently, but firmly. James paused, choosing his words carefully. He explained that he was a traveler, curious about the land and the people who lived there. He told them he meant no harm, and only wished to learn from them and understand their lives. The woman listened intently, then looked to her companions. They exchanged quiet words among themselves, glancing at James as if weighing his intentions. After a long pause, another woman stepped forward and said, "You will stay for now, but you must prove yourself." James nodded, accepting the challenge. He knew that this was not just about survival, it was about respect, patience, and understanding. Over the next few days, he continued helping in every way he could, from mending fences and tending animals to carrying water and gathering firewood. He began to notice subtle signs that the women were slowly warming to him. Smiles that lasted a little longer, nods of approval, and occasional invitations to join in conversation or song. During these days, James also began learning about the history of the village. Through gestures, drawings in the dirt, and simple words, he pieced together the story. 15 years ago, the men of the village had gone off to defend their homes or had been lost in conflicts with neighboring groups. The women were left to fend for themselves, to protect the children and maintain the settlement. It was not an easy life. There were times of hunger, times of danger, and times when despair must have been overwhelming. Yet the women endured, relying on each other's strength, knowledge, and courage. James felt a deep respect for their determination and unity. One afternoon, as he accompanied a group of women to gather wild herbs from the nearby hills, a sense of camaraderie began to grow. They worked together, pointing out which plants were safe to use, and teaching him how to identify roots, leaves, and berries. James listened carefully, asking questions with gestures, and doing his best to remember every detail. The women watched his efforts, sometimes nodding with approval, sometimes smiling at his mistakes. Slowly, he began to feel a part of their world. Not as an intruder, but as someone willing to learn and contribute. James also observed the children closely. They were full of energy and curiosity, watching him with wide eyes as he helped their mothers with chores. Sometimes, a child would shyly approach him, offering a small gift, a flower, a piece of fruit, or a simple stone, James accepted each with gratitude, knowing that these gestures were signs of growing trust. The children's laughter and playful chatter reminded him that life in the settlement was not just about survival. It was about community, learning, and the joy that could be found even in difficult circumstances. By the end of the week, James had gained small but meaningful trust from the women. One evening, they gathered around a fire, and he was invited to sit closer than before. They shared a simple meal, passing food and offering small gestures of friendship. He realized that he was beginning to understand their ways, their customs, their values, and their deep respect for each other. They spoke of traditions, of stories passed down from mothers to daughters, and of the importance of protecting their land and their families. Although he could not understand every word, the feelings behind them were clear: pride, courage, and resilience. James also learned about the challenges the women faced daily. They hunted carefully to avoid endangering the animals too much. They protected the children from wild animals and strangers, and they repaired their homes with limited materials. Every action was deliberate and purposeful, reflecting the experience gained over 15 years of self-reliance. Watching them, James understood that their survival was not just about physical strength but also about wisdom, strategy, and the ability to work together in harmony. As days turned into weeks, James became more integrated into the settlement's routine. He helped tend the gardens, repair roofs, and gather water from the stream. The women no longer regarded him solely as an outsider. They began to see him as someone who could be trusted, someone who respected their boundaries and contributed meaningfully to their lives. The initial tension and suspicion were replaced with cautious acceptance, and in rare moments, he even caught glimpses of smiles and laughter directed toward him. It was a slow process, but progress nonetheless. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the valley, James sat quietly by the stream, reflecting on what he had learned. The women had survived 15 years without men, not by chance, but through determination, intelligence, and unity. They had built a life that was both difficult and beautiful, a life that demanded respect and admiration. And now, after weeks of careful observation, patience, and consistent help, James felt that he had finally begun to earn their trust. He understood that trust here was precious and fragile, a bond that had been tested over years and would not be given lightly. For the first time, James felt a true connection to the settlement. He realized that this experience was changing him not just as a traveler exploring unknown lands, but as a person learning the value of patience, respect, and the strength of human resilience. The women had taught him more than survival skills. They had shown him what it meant to work together, to endure hardships, and to find joy and purpose in even the most difficult circumstances. As night fell and stars sparkled above the valley, James prepared for sleep once again, this time feeling a sense of belonging he had never known before. He knew the journey ahead would require more patience, understanding, and respect. There would be challenges and tests, but he was ready to face them. For the first time, he understood that gaining trust was not just about words or actions. It was about showing sincerity, humility, and the willingness to become part of something greater than oneself. And so, under the quiet watch of the mountains and the flickering glow of the settlement's fires, James drifted to sleep, knowing that his journey among the women of the hidden valley was only just beginning. The days ahead promised lessons, adventures, and the slow, careful building of a bond that could last a lifetime. He had come as a stranger, but he hoped to leave as a friend, respected and accepted, in a community that had endured 15 years without men, yet thrived through courage, unity, and unwavering determination. The days in the hidden valley passed with a steady rhythm, each sunrise bringing new tasks and lessons. James had begun to feel accepted, though cautiously, among the women. He had learned to carry water without spilling, to gather firewood efficiently, and to help tend the gardens and animals. The women no longer saw him as a complete outsider. Some even smiled at his attempts to follow their ways, appreciating his effort and sincerity. Yet, despite this growing bond, James knew that life in the valley was never easy. The mountains, the forests, and even the skies themselves held dangers, and the women had survived 15 years by being vigilant, skilled, and prepared. One morning, while James helped a group of women gather wild herbs on a nearby slope, they noticed signs of trouble. A few broken branches, the faint tracks of strangers, and the distant sound of horses' hooves carried across the wind. The women froze, exchanging glances filled with caution and concern. James instinctively crouched low, unsure of the danger but aware that the women were reacting with practiced alertness. He had seen how they had survived without men for so long they did not panic easily. Instead, they observed, assessed, and prepared for action. The group quickly moved back toward the settlement, using the trees and rocks for cover. James followed, doing his best to mimic their silent movements. As they reached the edge of the village, the women began signaling to those inside, warning of a possible threat approaching. Everyone hurried to secure the settlement, bringing tools, weapons, and animals to safety. James watched in awe as they coordinated efficiently, demonstrating the skills that had kept them alive for so many years. There was no shouting, no chaos, only calm, precise actions that reflected their experience and unity. Soon, a small group of outsiders appeared on horseback near the valley's entrance. They were men, strangers to the women, and James felt the tension rise immediately. The women quickly formed a defensive perimeter, using their knowledge of the land to their advantage. They had traps and barriers prepared, hidden paths to move silently, and weapons at the ready. James felt a surge of admiration mixed with fear. These women had survived attacks, wild animals, and the harshness of isolation for over a decade, and now, in a single moment, he was witnessing the full strength of their courage and strategy. The strangers advanced cautiously, unaware of the women's defenses. James realized he had a choice: stand back and watch, or help in some way without causing more risk. One of the older women motioned him to carry water to those tending the traps, and he obeyed quickly, moving as silently as he could. He watched the younger women lure the men into positions where the terrain gave the women an advantage. Every movement was calculated. The strangers had no idea what awaited them, while the women of the valley were calm, confident, and ready. James felt both nervous and inspired. He had never seen such bravery combined with intelligence in action. The encounter was tense but brief. The strangers, realizing the settlement was too well defended to attack, eventually retreated. They left behind a few tools and small items, but more importantly, they left the women and James unharmed. The women exhaled, some collapsing with relief, while others immediately returned to checking the village and the children. James helped wherever he could, carrying supplies, reinforcing barriers, and assisting the injured animals. For the first time, he understood what it meant to survive in the Wild West, not just to hunt or gather, but to protect, strategize, and act with courage when danger approached. After the encounter, the women gathered near the largest fire pit in the settlement. Their faces were serious, yet there was pride in their eyes. They spoke to each other softly, exchanging information, reviewing the situation, and ensuring everyone understood the precautions for the future. James could not understand every word, but he felt their determination, their unwavering commitment to protect their home, and their ability to work together under pressure. For him, it was a lesson in resilience and unity that no books or stories could ever teach. In the days following the incident, James took on more responsibilities. He helped repair damaged fences, reinforce the huts, and learned to carry heavy loads over rough terrain. The women taught him how to anticipate the movements of animals, how to spot signs of danger, and how to move silently across the land. He learned quickly, motivated by the respect he had begun to earn and the realization that he was now a part of their world, even if only a small part. Each task, each challenge, strengthened his bond with the women and deepened his understanding of their lives. One afternoon, as they worked together near the stream, James noticed the way the women communicated without words. A glance, a subtle gesture, a change in stance, everything conveyed meaning. They had lived 15 years relying on these signals, and now he was learning to recognize and respond to them. He marveled at their teamwork, realizing that it was not just physical skill that had allowed them to survive, but a deep understanding of each other and the environment around them. It was a form of communication and cooperation that went beyond words. A connection built on trust and experience. The incident with the outsiders also brought moments of reflection. The women spoke to James about the importance of vigilance and preparation, not out of fear, but out of respect for the land and the life they had built. They shared stories of past challenges, storms that had destroyed crops, wild animals that had threatened their children, and occasional travelers who had posed danger. James listened carefully, absorbing each lesson. He realized that survival here was about more than strength. It was about wisdom, strategy, and the ability to remain calm under pressure. As the week progressed, James began to earn more trust. The women allowed him closer to their daily routines, inviting him to help with more critical tasks and teaching him subtle skills, like weaving baskets and handling small animals. They observed his actions carefully, correcting mistakes gently and praising effort. For James, it was a humbling experience. He had come to the valley as a traveler, seeking knowledge, but he found himself learning lessons far beyond anything he had imagined. Lessons about courage, patience, respect, and the quiet strength that comes from years of facing adversity together. One evening, after a long day of work, the women gathered to share stories by the fire. James sat quietly among them, listening as they spoke of the past and shared wisdom with the younger girls. The children were present too, laughing and mimicking the adults' movements. James felt a warmth in his chest as he observed this scene. Despite the hardships, despite 15 years without men, the women had created a thriving community filled with learning, care, and resilience. They had not only survived, they had built something beautiful. James also reflected on his own transformation. He had entered the valley as an outsider, unsure of his place, cautious and respectful. Now, after weeks of observation, work, and shared experiences, he felt like he belonged. He had earned a place among the women, not as a leader, but as someone who contributed meaningfully to their lives. He understood that trust was fragile, that respect was earned through consistent action, and that courage came in many forms, not just in facing danger, but in living honestly, helping others, and being part of a community. One morning, while helping to repair a section of the garden fence, a sudden storm approached. Dark clouds rolled over the mountains, and wind began to howl through the trees. The women sprang into action, securing animals, reinforcing shelters, and guiding the children to safety. James moved quickly alongside them, carrying heavy bundles, tying ropes, and lending his strength wherever it was needed. The storm was fierce, shaking the valley and drenching everyone in cold rain. But the women remained composed, their knowledge and preparation allowing them to manage the situation effectively. After hours of effort, the storm passed, leaving the valley soaked but intact. The women gathered around a large fire, drying clothes, tending to minor injuries, and comforting the children. James sat among them, exhausted but filled with awe. He realized that these challenges, storms, wild animals, outsiders, had shaped the women into the remarkable people they were. They had learned to face adversity with courage and intelligence, and in doing so, they had taught him lessons he would carry for the rest of his life. By the end of Part 3, James had experienced danger, teamwork, and the strength of the women firsthand. He had learned to anticipate challenges, respond calmly under pressure, and contribute meaningfully to the survival of the settlement. The women had begun to see him not just as a visitor, but as someone who understood the value of their lives, respected their skills, and was willing to work alongside them. Through shared danger and daily challenges, bonds had formed slowly, carefully, and with deep significance. James lay under the stars that night, reflecting on everything he had learned. He knew the journey ahead would bring more challenges, more lessons, and perhaps even deeper connections, but he also knew that he had grown, that he had become part of a story far greater than his own, and that the women of the Hidden Valley had taught him what true strength, resilience, and unity could mean. And as the firelight flickered across the valley, James understood that he had truly begun to become part of this extraordinary world, a world that had survived 15 years without men, yet thrived through courage, intelligence, and unbreakable bonds of trust. The valley had begun to feel like home to James. Each morning, the sunlight touched the hills with golden warmth, and he rose with a sense of purpose he had never known before. Over the weeks, he had learned the routines of the women, the rhythms of the land, and the quiet ways in which they lived in harmony with nature. They had survived 15 years without men, yet their lives were filled with skill, care, and an enduring spirit. James had earned their trust gradually, through patience, hard work, and respect. But now, he sensed that a deeper connection was beginning to form. One early morning, he accompanied the older women to a hidden grove where medicinal plants grew. They moved with ease, pointing out roots and leaves that could heal injuries, soothe aches, or prevent illness. James listened carefully, taking notes in his mind, asking questions through gestures and simple words. The women observed him closely, assessing his understanding and sincerity. Occasionally, one would smile and nod, a sign that he was learning quickly. He marveled at how much knowledge the women possessed, wisdom gained from years of surviving in the wilderness. He realized that their strength was not just physical. It was rooted in experience, intelligence, and the ability to adapt. As the sun climbed higher, James noticed the younger women approaching him with woven baskets of fresh berries and herbs. They invited him to help prepare a meal, teaching him how to combine ingredients for flavor and nourishment. At first, he struggled, spilling herbs or adding too much water. But the women were patient, guiding his hands and correcting him gently. Slowly, he began to understand not only the techniques but also the care and intention behind each action. Cooking became more than a task. It was a way to connect, a way to share life and work side by side. The laughter and small smiles that accompanied the lessons were signs of the trust and affection growing between them. The days were filled with learning, but also with small joys. James accompanied the children to a nearby creek, teaching them simple games and helping them fish with handmade nets. He watched as they splashed in the water, their laughter ringing through the valley. The women observed from a distance, sometimes joining in, sometimes tending to chores, but always watching carefully. James realized that these moments, though simple, were vital. They strengthened bonds, built trust, and reminded everyone that life could hold happiness even in isolation. One afternoon, the women invited James to participate in a traditional dance, a ritual passed down for generations. At first, he felt nervous, unsure of the movements and the meaning behind them. But the women guided him patiently, showing each step and explaining its significance. The dance told stories of survival, community, and connection to the land. As James moved alongside them, he felt a sense of belonging unlike anything he had experienced. The rhythm of the drums, the flow of the steps, and the unity of the group created a bond that went beyond words. He began to understand that these traditions were not just cultural, they were the threads that held the community together. During these lessons, James also learned about the past hardships the women had endured. Through gestures, stories, and drawings in the dirt, they shared memories of the challenges faced when men had disappeared from the settlement. There were tales of hunger, fierce storms, and the constant vigilance required to protect the children and homes. James listened quietly, humbled by their courage and resilience. He understood that these stories were not told to complain or mourn, but to teach, to remind each generation of the strength required to survive and thrive. As the days turned into weeks, James noticed a subtle change in the way the women interacted with him. They began to trust him with more personal tasks, such as tending the younger children or assisting in critical repairs around the settlement. He no longer felt like an observer. He was a participant, contributing meaningfully to the daily life of the community. Occasionally, one of the women would offer advice or guidance, and he would follow it carefully, earning nods of approval. These small acknowledgments, though simple, meant more than words could express. They were signs that he was becoming part of their lives, respected and valued. One evening, as the sun dipped below the mountains, casting the valley in a warm, golden light, James joined the women in preparing for a seasonal celebration. This was a time when the settlement honored the land, the harvest, and the unity that had kept them alive for 15 years. Everyone worked together, decorating the huts with woven garlands, arranging baskets of fruits and herbs, and preparing food for the feast. James felt a deep sense of connection as he participated. He understood that this was more than celebration. It was a reaffirmation of identity, resilience, and shared purpose. During the preparations, one of the older women spoke to him in a quiet moment. She pointed to the hills beyond the valley and made gestures suggesting the importance of vigilance and care. James nodded, understanding that respect for the land and its dangers was central to their way of life. It was not enough to simply live. One had to understand, adapt, and honor the environment. This lesson resonated deeply with him, reminding him of the wisdom that came from experience and observation rather than just books or stories. As night fell, the settlement gathered around a large fire. The women sang songs of survival and hope, stories passed down from mothers to daughters. James listened, feeling the power of their voices and the weight of their history. Occasionally, the women included him in small ways, asking him to beat a drum or help arrange the firewood. These gestures, though minor, symbolized trust and acceptance. James realized that he was no longer merely a visitor. He had become part of the rhythm and life of the settlement. In the following days, James faced small challenges that tested his skills and his understanding of the community. One morning, a minor injury occurred while gathering firewood. James was asked to help clean and dress the wound under the guidance of the women. He carefully followed instructions, applying herbs and bandages as taught. The woman who had been injured watched him closely, and when he finished correctly, she nodded in approval. This experience reinforced James's sense of responsibility and the importance of learning, listening, and acting with care. The bond between James and the women grew steadily. They began to share simple conversations, gestures, and laughter. Occasionally, they would ask him about his life before the valley, listening intently as he spoke of travels, stories, and lessons he had learned. In turn, he asked questions about their traditions, hopes, and experiences. Though words were limited, the shared moments, mutual respect, and willingness to learn created a connection that transcended language. Trust, he realized, was built not just by actions, but by understanding, empathy, and genuine care. One afternoon, James helped a group of women repair a damaged section of the roof after a heavy rain. The work was difficult, requiring strength, coordination, and patience. The women guided him carefully, showing him how to lift beams, secure thatch, and balance on uneven surfaces. James worked diligently, mindful of their guidance and careful not to cause harm. By the end of the day, the roof was repaired, stronger than before, and the women acknowledged his effort with smiles and nods. These small successes strengthened his sense of belonging and reinforced the idea that trust and respect were earned through consistent effort. As Part 4 came to a close, James had become deeply connected to the women and their way of life. He had learned their skills, participated in their traditions, and faced challenges alongside them. He was no longer an outsider. He had become part of the community, respected and valued for his contributions and his willingness to learn. Yet, he also understood the delicate balance of trust and independence. The women had survived for 15 years without men, and their strength and unity were to be honored, not replaced or altered. That night, under a sky filled with countless stars, James reflected on his journey. He thought of the lessons learned, the dangers faced, and the bonds formed. He realized that this experience had changed him profoundly. The women had taught him about courage, patience, resilience, and the power of community. He had come seeking knowledge and adventure, but he had found something far deeper, a connection to a people who had endured, thrived, and created a world of their own. As the firelight flickered across the settlement, the women and children settled for the night, and James lay nearby, feeling a sense of belonging unlike anything he had experienced before. He knew that the journey ahead would continue to test him, offering new lessons, challenges, and opportunities to grow, but he was ready. Strengthened by the trust he had earned, the knowledge he had gained, and the bonds he had formed. In the quiet of the night, surrounded by the rhythm of the valley and the warmth of the community, James understood that he had truly become part of this extraordinary world, a world of courage, wisdom, and unbreakable spirit. The morning air in the valley was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and earth. James woke early, as was his habit, watching the first rays of sunlight touch the mountains and the settlement below. Over the weeks, he had grown deeply attached to this place, the women who had survived 15 years without men, their children, and the rhythms of life they had built. He had come as a traveler, curious and cautious, but now he felt a profound connection. He had learned their ways, shared their work, and earned their trust. Yet he knew that the valley, while beautiful, could never be free from challenges. That very morning, a distant smoke column caught James's eye. He raised his hand, signaling to one of the older women who stood nearby. Her eyes followed the direction he pointed, and her face grew tense. James understood immediately. Something was happening beyond the hills. The women quickly organized themselves, gathering their children and securing the settlement. James moved alongside them, offering his help where he could, ready to do whatever was necessary to protect the community that had welcomed him. Soon, the source of the smoke became clearer. A fire had started in the dry forest on the edge of the valley. The flames spread quickly, driven by the wind, threatening the trees, the wildlife, and possibly the settlement itself. The women had faced dangers before, but this fire posed a threat unlike anything they had encountered in recent years. Panic was not an option. James could see the calm determination in their eyes, the silent coordination that came from years of experience. He knew that this was the moment to show not just his skills, but his loyalty and courage. They divided into teams, each with a clear purpose. Some women worked to create fire breaks, clearing brush and digging trenches to stop the fire from reaching the village. Others focused on moving animals to safety, while a few prepared water sources to douse approaching flames. James was assigned to help carry water and reinforce the fire breaks. The work was grueling, the sun hot, and the smoke thick, but he did not complain. He followed instructions carefully, carrying buckets of water and helping to clear vegetation. Feeling the weight of responsibility on his shoulders, the children were kept at a safe distance, guided by a few older women who ensured they remained calm and out of harm's way. James watched as the younger women moved with grace and strength, despite the danger. Their coordination was astonishing. They knew instinctively what needed to be done, who to help, and how to protect each other. James had learned much from them over the weeks, but now he experienced firsthand how extraordinary their skills truly were. It was not just survival, it was strategy, courage, and unity combined. As the fire advanced, the situation became more critical. James noticed a small section of the forest where flames threatened to jump the fire break. Without hesitation, he ran toward the danger, carrying water and coordinating with the women nearby. They worked together, pouring water, cutting down dry branches, and ensuring the fire did not spread further. Each action required focus, strength, and trust in one another. James felt a rush of adrenaline, but also a sense of purpose he had never felt before. He was not just helping. He was contributing meaningfully to the safety and survival of the entire community. Hours passed, and the fire gradually began to lose strength. The women's experience, combined with James's efforts, successfully contained it. Smoke still hung heavy in the valley, but the settlement and surrounding land were safe. Exhausted but relieved, the community gathered near the largest fire pit. They assessed the damage, tended to minor injuries, and comforted the children. James helped wherever he could, carrying water, assisting with repairs, and offering words of reassurance through gestures and simple words. The women's eyes met his occasionally, conveying approval and gratitude without the need for many words. After the immediate danger had passed, the settlement returned to a quieter rhythm. James had proven himself in a situation that demanded courage, quick thinking, and resilience. The women now saw him not only as a trusted helper, but as someone who had faced danger alongside them and contributed to the survival of the community. The bond between them had deepened, built on shared experience, mutual respect, and the understanding that they could rely on him in critical moments. In the days following the fire, the women and James worked to repair minor damage and restore the environment around the settlement. They planted new crops where the fire had burned, reinforced fences, and replenished water storage. James continued to learn from them, picking up new skills and refining old ones. He understood that survival was not just about facing danger. It was about preparation, care, and the ability to adapt to changing circumstances. The women's resilience, patience, and wisdom were qualities he admired deeply, and he strove to reflect them in his actions. During one quiet evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, the women gathered to share stories around the fire. They spoke of the challenges they had faced over the past 15 years, the hardships, the losses, and the triumphs. James listened intently, humbled by their courage and dedication. The children sat close, learning from the stories and absorbing lessons about bravery, unity, and respect for the land. For James, this was a moment of deep reflection. He realized that he had become part of a living history, a witness to the strength and resilience of a community that had faced unimaginable challenges and emerged stronger. In the weeks that followed, James found a sense of belonging he had never known. The women included him in more aspects of their daily life, teaching him rituals, dances, and songs that celebrated survival, the land, and community. He learned how to weave, tend animals, and prepare traditional meals. More importantly, he learned how to observe, listen, and act with care and respect. He had come seeking knowledge and adventure, but he had gained wisdom, understanding, and the profound joy of being part of a community that valued each person's contribution. One day, while walking through the valley, James noticed a young girl struggling to carry a heavy basket of herbs. He immediately stepped forward to help, offering his strength without taking control. The girl smiled, accepting the assistance, and together they reached the destination. A nearby woman watched and nodded in approval, signaling that James's actions reflected the lessons he had learned: respect, humility, and cooperation. Small acts like this reinforced the bond between him and the settlement, reminding him that true belonging comes from both giving and receiving support. As time passed, the women began to share more personal stories with James. They spoke of hopes for the future, their dreams for the children, and the values they wished to pass down. He listened carefully, absorbing every word and gesture. He understood that their independence did not mean isolation. It meant strength, wisdom, and careful choice. His presence had become a part of the community, not to replace or change it, but to support it, to contribute meaningfully while respecting the women's leadership and experience. Eventually, James realized that his journey in the valley was approaching a turning point. He had arrived as a stranger, curious and cautious. He had faced challenges, learned skills, and built trust. He had contributed to the survival of the settlement during the fire and proven himself a reliable and respectful companion. Yet he also understood that the women's lives were theirs first and foremost, and his role was to honor and support, not dominate or alter. He had become part of their story, but their story remained uniquely theirs, a story of courage, unity, and resilience. On his final evening in the valley, James joined the women and children in a quiet ceremony near the stream. They gathered flowers, sang songs, and shared simple food. There were smiles, laughter, and moments of reflection. James felt a deep sense of gratitude and belonging. He had learned lessons that would stay with him for life: patience, respect, courage, and the power of a community bound together by care, trust, and shared responsibility. He understood that survival was not just about facing danger, it was about connection, empathy, and the strength found in unity. As he prepared to leave the valley the next morning, the women gathered to see him off. There were hugs, nods, and silent acknowledgments of the bond they had formed. James felt a mixture of sadness and pride. He had come as a traveler, but he was leaving as someone who had been embraced, respected, and accepted. The settlement would continue to thrive, enriched by the brief but meaningful time he had spent with them. And he carried their lessons, wisdom, and spirit with him as he continued his journey. Mountains and valleys stretched out before him as he rode away, the wind carrying the scent of pine and earth. He glanced back at the settlement, now small in the distance, and smiled. The women had survived 15 years without men, yet they had built a thriving, vibrant, and strong community. He had been privileged to witness their courage, to share in their work, and to learn from their wisdom. As the sun rose higher, James felt a renewed sense of purpose and understanding, knowing that some experiences change a person forever. He had come seeking adventure, but he had found life lessons, friendship, and the quiet power of human resilience.